First, I'm a huge fan of podcast stage. So I want to point out that Bandrew never argued that someone should use a cloud lifter. I have never seen him shill for anything. But I am nitpicking that in the last video, he shouldn't have brought them up because, well, in my opinion, they are bad audio engineering. Now, I know that's an odd thing to say, even worse than odd, because I admit that if both Bandrew and I were hired to engineer podcasts, I would make a total mess of it. Bandrew, on the other hand, would produce first-class audio. So in practical terms, I'm not going to win any arguments here. I'm not even going to try. But I do believe my criticisms are valid and important to understand. I do believe at the end of this, Bandrew, you, and I, we will all be the better for it. And maybe I'm wrong in many things, and I will be the one eating my hat. I just have to keep pressing forward. Anyway, no one likes to deal with criticism. Though Bandrew was annoyed, he never stopped responding to my questions on his video. Most people aren't like that, so Bandrew is exceptional. Anyway, this video is not about calling Bandrew wrong. I'm only going into some details which he can choose to respond to or not. I'd love to see Bandrew and Julian Krause do a joint video exploring this subject in more detail. I truly don't know if it's better to use an SM7B with 2 amps or a more sensitive dynamic with 1 amp. Obviously, it's definitely better if all you have are SM7Bs and you have the money for a second amp. However, I believe most people who follow Bandrew have multiple mics, so this would be a very good, legitimate question to study. So what's the question? Let me get into it. Here's our microphone, and this would be our SM7B. And the way an amplifier works is the SMB, your sound, will basically move this wire along a magnet, which generates a very, very small electrical current. And so the current would flow around here if it could. The way an amplifier works is you essentially have like a gate, and I made it sort of, I don't know how to explain this, but yeah, just imagine this goes up or down. So normally it's up. And then when a current comes out of it, it presses this little gate down, and this little gate is attached to a big gate with a whole bunch of electrons waiting to get across. So that's your amplified signal. And the battery just is symbolizing our power source. So the SMB, you speak into it, creates a sound, it creates a small electrical current hits this gate. The gate pushes down a large gate, which lets a whole bunch of electrons through. And these electrons go into this wire, and then they're eventually digitized by your USB device. Oops. What happens again is we get some electrons from the mic, and they hit this small gate, pushes down, and it releases a lot of electrons from our amplifier into our wire. And the number of electrons here, so let's just say for the sake of argument, every 1 electron here will equal 10 electrons here. That's the whole idea of the amplification. But no matter what we have the gain set on, all amplifiers have this problem where these gates are not 100% efficient. Therefore, there's going to be noise that gets through. And each one of these does not match anything here. So you're getting a 1 here, but there's a 0 here. So this isn't part of the original current. Essentially, that's the definition of noise. So let's talk about noise floor here, because this is where I believe many of the misconceptions begin. If there's no current from the microphone, right, no current going over the gate, and you set the amplifier to maximum gain, which is, in other words, the maximum amount of signal you can get, maximum amount of amplification, you're going to get noise. You're going to get electrons that flow over the gate that shouldn't flow over the gate because they don't match any signal. So one way to measure audio equipment is to put it on maximum gain, the maximum amplification you can get, find out your noise, and make that a measurement of what your quote like noise floor is. So in a sense, it's if you, in a signal, let's say you have the signal from, strong, oops, let's say you have the signal from strong to weak. This is your signal, right? So in a noise floor, essentially what you're doing is you're saying if you try and reach down as far down into a weak signal as possible, at what point, again, pushing that around, at what point are you getting this noise that you can actually hear in how you're going to convert this to digital? So in your pre-converting to digital, how much noise do you hear? And that's essentially the noise floor, which is right here. So, you'll see 130, negative 130, dB or whatever. So I just want to point that out. Now, the misconception, which I'm going to get to, is that you can't separate this noise. This is theoretical in a sense, right? I mean, you're putting on maximum. You have no source, and you're measuring the noise. And now you're going to sort of think like, okay, I've measured the maximum noise. If I put my level right here above it where I don't get that noise, then there's no noise. That is incorrect. As I just went over, noise is always embedded in your signal, no matter what you have your gain amp. So your measurement of noise at maximum amplification is only one abstract measurement that you cannot extrapolate into the actual working of your amplifier. Here I have in this slide, all analog amplifiers include add noise, no matter what their signal. So when an amp is operating, noise is getting into the signal. I've illustrated them as green. The signal to noise ratio is an estimate. It's only an estimate of how many electrons match the original signal and how many don't. So let's ask a practical question. And by the way, I did ask Bandrew, and he did answer it the way I would answer it, actually. But anyway, so the question is, how much worse in real life is an SM7B working through two amplifiers instead of one? Even with the limited noise floor calculations, has that been tested? It's I haven't seen really a test. I mean, I see a test of comparing the noise floors with both mics, but I don't really see a real-world test of digitally amplifying a weak preamp with an SM7B and putting some noise reduction versus using the physical preamp. Anyway, the test of a noise floor is easy. What about test of signal distortion? Isn't that what really matters in the end? Of course it does, but it's so hard to measure these, I think, electronically. And in the end, there's so many subjective factors, as Bandrew points out. You're speaking directly into the mic, or you off access. There are many things that can change all this, and are definitely much bigger factors than the secondary preamp. Okay, so how does an SM7B compare to a more sensitive mic going through a weak amplifier? What is it about the SM7B that makes it worth the cost in 2 amp noise? Now, to me, it would never be worth the cost. Not from my testing necessarily, but just from, I just don't believe it'll work better. So I feel I'd be chasing my tail and trying to get it to work better. I don't like the idea of this unwanted noise distortion in my signal. And again, Bandrew answered in the same way. But he is definitely not saying, and I am definitely not saying, that you shouldn't use a cloud lifter. And if you have one, you should throw it out, or you shouldn't buy one. Again, everybody has to make their own choice. The only thing I'm trying to do in this video is point out the issue. And then you can decide if the issue means anything into practice for you or not. If it doesn't, ignore it, right? I mean, because there's no perfect mic, there's no perfect setup, there's no perfect anything. We use what we want to, what we have, and what we prefer, and whatever. So again, this is not an anti-cloud lifter video. That said, let me go through the argument that Bandrew repeated, and which is all over the internet about why the cloud lifter, the circumstance where a cloud lifter can work, or believe that people believe it can work. So we have a weak preamp that generates 100, let's just say, in current for every 2 in noise. At 500, its max is giving out 500 current with 10 in noise, which, if we try and digitally amplify, is too noisy. We hear this noise. So I'm not pretending this is not a problem. If it's set to 250 in current, it generates 5 in noise, but that 500 and 250 isn't enough to provide a strong signal to our recording device. That means that digitally we really have to boost it up, and again, we don't like it to 10 in noise. So how do we get rid of that noise that we can hear if we max out the gain in the first amplifier, and then put it through a second amplifier, do nothing at all? Okay, so we then take a preamp, a cloud lifter, it's our second amp, and it generates, for every 100 in current it generates, it only has 1 in noise, right? So it's much better than the weak preamp. The weak preamp is generating 2 in noise, and the cloud lifter, let's just say, is doing 1 in noise. So let's do the math. If it takes 250 in current, if we take the 250 in current from our weak preamp, we get 5 in noise. And if we double it to 500, we have 5 in noise from the first amp, right, which is at half gain. The 2.5 in noise from the second inline amp, which gives us 7.5 noise, which is much less, right, than the 10 noise we'd get if we max out our current, our one amplifier. So this is the justification. So that's better than the 10 in noise from a weak amp maxed out. Therefore, there is less noticeable noise using a cloud lifter than the first amp maxed out. This is true, but only if you're measuring noise against a blank background. Okay, here I'm just showing a graphic illustration of it. We have the first amp, 250 signal, plus the 250 signal of the second amp gives us the 500 signal we need. So we're adding the 5 noise from the first amp to the 2.5 noise of the second amp, and we're getting the 7.5 noise. Is this the correct way to look at it? I'm going to explain why I don't think it is. Again, the first amplification has embedded noise which cannot be removed. If it could, right, we'd never need a second amp. Therefore, the second amplification amplifies that embedded noise in the first signal, even if we didn't notice it. That is, the second amp is multiplying the first amp's embedded noise by some factor x. When one listens to a noise floor, they're listening to noise against a blank background. They forget that the noise gets added to everything when we actually use the amplifier for what it's intended for. That is, we can't hear it against a blank background, but we may have just as much noise in our signal, that is 10 in our example, nonetheless. Let me show you it in diagram form. So I believe this is how it works. And again, if you're an audio engineer or whatever, please let me know if this is wrong. So we have a first amp, which is a 250 signal gain, right? And we have 5 noise. But what really happens with the second amp is we're multiplying, in a sense, that gain. We're amplifying that signal. We're not amplifying the microphone signal anymore. We're amplifying the signal coming out of the amplifier, which has the embedded noise. This embedded noise is in what goes into this gain. So that means from the second amp, we have 5 times, let's just say, the noise from the first thing. So even before we look at anything else, we have this unknown amount of noise that we've just basically amplified. So in other words, if we had, let's just say in any second where we had 5 electrons of noise in here, in this thing, it's going to make it 10 electrons, right? That noise. And it can't filter what these out. Whatever noise is embedded in the first amp that's output is going to get, right, amplified. So we take a first amp, we take our inline secondary amplifier, we do the gain, we amplify the noise in it, and then we can add on the 2.5, theoretical noise we know from testing the noise floor. And then we get to our digital signal, which is, again, I think theoretically, 5 times the gain, the noise in the first amplifier, plus the self noise of the second amplifier, so to speak. So what does this equal? Who knows? So my question is, if this is true, you guys have to let me know, should this always be pointed out when discussing the use of a second inline amp? I believe yes. And that's sort of where I was nitpicking Bandrew about. It's taken us a very long conversation for me to be able to explain it in this way. And thank you, Badgering, because I really had to think about it hard as we discussed it. Like, how do I explain this? Like, is this true? Like, what is there a problem? You know, again, I've learned a lot just going through this. All right, so, and then I think what happens in practice on the internet is the noise floor. This is easy to measure, right? You put the gain on 100. You open up Audacity, right? You listen to it. You look at the signal, and then you can make an eyeball thing or just listen to it to hear the noise coming out of any sort of amplifier. But it's not easy to measure how much an amplifier is amplifying the noise that always exists in another amplified signal, which makes it easy to ignore if you want to. So, unless it's very obvious when you put in a cloud lifter on an SM7B that's distorting the voice, you can make the argument, yeah, it's fine. I don't care. I mean, yeah, I understand theoretically that it's there, but I don't hear it, so it doesn't exist. But you don't really hear this either, right? Because you're not running the amps at 100% capacity, right? So you don't hear this either. This is just a theoretical thing in your head, which you're using to talk yourself into. This isn't an issue, but it is.